Let's look at how we'd implement Lewin's force field theory with an example. We're going to use Blumhouse Productions. So Blumhouse Productions is a Hollywood movie studio, but they're not in the business of making big movies, big blockbuster movies. They make sort of smaller horror movies, and they make them cheap, and they have three rules. Don't have too many speaking parts, don't have too many locations, and pay the talent the minimum you can up front, as in the big time actors, and have them agree to share in the profits of the movie instead. And they do that because it makes the movie cheaper to produce. And their strategy is to make 4 or 5 movies a year. They're not all going to be successes, but we're hoping that 1 or 2 will be popular and financially successful. It will not only make a big profit, but it will kind of help subsidize the ones that don't do so well. So to understand how Blumhouse works, we need to look at how big Hollywood movies work. So these are not Blumhouse movies. We're going to talk about the highest grossing movies of all time. Movies grossing in Hollywood basically means revenues. What were your box office ticket sales? Minus your expenses, which in Hollywood is called your budget. You get a net profit, and then we get a return on investment. And these are the 4 biggest movies of all time. Avatar had revenues or ticket sales of 2.8 billion. It cost 237 million to make, which if you follow that through ends up with a big net profit and a return on investment of 1101%, which is staggering, because if you invested money with the bank right now, you'd get about 2%. This is 1101%. The next biggest movie of all time is Avengers End Game. Again, a lot of money at the box office, but also didn't cost relatively that much to make. So the return on investment was 686%. Next biggest movie was Titanic. Big box office return, and the return on investment was 1001%. And lastly, the 4th biggest movie of all time was Star Wars Episode 7. Cost $245 million to make, and ends up with a return on investment of 745%. So very successful movies, but not every studio can make movies that big. These are big Hollywood studios that make these. So like the Marvel franchise, for example, has a lot of money. Blumhouse can't do that. So they try and make smaller movies. So you look at this movie here, The Boy Next Door, only had $52 million in ticket sales, but it only cost $4 million to make. So if you follow that through, that's a net profit of $48 million, or a return on investment of 1210%. That is bigger than the return on investment of any of those big 4 blockbuster movies. It also flows through to their other movies. So if we look at Invisible Man, $143 million at the box office, only cost $7 million to make. That's a return on investment of 1946%. Looking at The Purge, there's a movie that only takes place in 1 location. They keep the cost low for $3 million. So the return on investment is 2,877%. The movie Split, that's probably the biggest movie of all time in terms of revenues and ticket sales. Return on investment still only cost $9 million to make. So you're looking at a massive return on investment of 2,993%. Get Out, it's probably the most well-known movie. That cost only $4.5 million. So a return on investment of 5,580%. But the most profitable movie of all time is Paranormal Activity. Now, it only did $193 million at the box office, which is nowhere near what Avengers or Avatar did. But it also only cost $15,000 to make. It's got 1 location, 2 actors, and the actors film the movie. So the net profit on that is really high, and we end up with a return on investment of 1,289,233%. What does all this info tell us? It tells us that Blumhouse doesn't sell a lot of movie ticket sales. They sell a lot, like relative to how big the studio is, because their movies don't cost a lot to make. That is their business model. However, here's the problem and the change. No one goes to the movies anymore. So we can see even pre-COVID, movie ticket sales were going down, and they have over time. If you actually look at the blue bar in terms of tickets sold, movie sales have been going down for a long time. So what does that mean? It means people have stopped going because of COVID, streaming services, etc. And if we're Blumhouse, we've got to figure out how we're going to get revenues if no one's going to pay $20 to go to the movies anymore. And that is going to link into Lewin's theory. So we can say there is a problem situation. That is where there's a difference between how things are, the present state, and how we'd like them to be, which we call a desired future state. The business can't stay here, it's got to get over here. And to do that, we need to implement a strategy. So our problem is no one goes to the cinema anymore, no one pays. Our problem, or our desired future state, is people will still pay to watch our movies. So what we're going to need to do is come up with a strategy or a change. So why don't we say, instead of releasing our movies in the cinema, to get from the present state to the desired future state, we are going to only distribute movies through streaming, all going to go straight to Netflix, for example, or Amazon or whatever. And what we've got is some driving forces. These are the things that are going to support and encourage us to make that change. And there's also going to be some restraining forces that prevent that change from occurring. And we're going to rank those, or weight them, from 1 to 5. From 1 being very weak to 5 very strong. So let's start with the driving forces. We could say finances. It is much cheaper to make a movie and distribute it over Netflix than it is to release in cinemas. Releasing in cinemas has a lot of cost involved, so we could say that's a really strong force. I'm going to give that a weighting of 5. Now these are just subjective ratings, but I rate that a very, very strong factor. 2, a driving force is directors. Hollywood movie directors are now becoming more receptive to releasing their movies on streaming instead of cinema. We've seen Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg do this recently. That's a big deal. I've given that a weighting of 2. Next, technology. I've given that a weighting of 4. There are better internet speeds and apps. People can watch anything, anywhere, anytime, on any device. That is definitely a driving force to only streaming our movies and not releasing them in cinemas. We've also got customers. I think a lot of customers now, a lot of people still do like to go to the movies, but a lot of people now actually prefer to watch a movie at home or wherever they might be, on the way to work, on the train or whatever. I'm going to give that a weighting of 3. And lastly, competitors. Some other movie studios are also now streaming only or mostly their movies. So they're doing it, then I guess we better do it too, otherwise we're going to get left behind. However, there are some restraining forces to doing this. Why isn't everyone doing this? Well, let's look at some. A weighting of 5 is finances. You can say finances were a driving force. Well, a driving force can also be a restraining force. Because if you have a big Hollywood type movie that's, costs $300 million to make, you're not going to get that. You're not going to make that money back from Netflix. So this really is only going to work for movies that cost a few $1,000,000 to make. That's actually not many movies. Most movies cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make. So that's a very strong restraining force. Next, directors. We also had directors as a driving force, but they are a restraining force because a lot of directors still won't allow their movies to go to streaming before the cinema. You want a big name director, they'll say, my movie has to go to the cinema because only crap movies go to direct to streaming. That's the perception they've had over time, way back to the 80s when things would go straight to VHS. Well, that's still a thing. We just say they go straight to streaming, and a lot of directors don't want to do that. What about this one, organizational inertia? We're going to look at this later on and sort of figure out what the definition of this means. But basically, for us now, it just means it's always been done a certain way and we don't want to change it. So, for example, movies have always been released in cinemas. There's always been red carpet premieres. To win an Academy Award or even be nominated, you have to be released at the cinema. So that is I've given that a weighting of 3. That's a strong restraining force to not just move to streaming. Customers were a driving force. We said a lot of customers like streaming. We could also argue, well, a lot still don't. I don't know how many, but I've given that a strong or a sort of a relatively weaker force of saying there's still many people who would prefer to go to the cinema, particularly for the big cinematic experience, the big blockbuster movies, a Marvel or a Star Wars. That's the sort of movie you do want to watch at the cinema. So all up, I had 5 driving forces and I had 4 restraining forces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add up these weightings. 5, 2, 4, 3, and 4 is 18. And then I'm going to do the same for the restraining forces. 5, 3, 3, and 2, that's a weighting of 13. So my initial evaluation using Lewin is that change will happen here. Why? Because the weight of the driving forces is greater than the weight of the restraining forces. So if I'm using this theory, I guess what I'm saying, if I'm running Blumhouse, I'm saying don't fight this change. We should implement this. We should only distribute our movies through streaming. And what my job as a manager to do is now to come up with some strategies to promote or encourage those driving forces. So what could I do? I could make more movies in the $5 million budget range. If I'm not going to get a big haul back at the box office, I better keep my movies cheap to make. So that's one way I could encourage this change. I could also sign distribution deals with all the major streaming services to make sure my movies come out before the cinema, but they're also on Netflix, Stan, Amazon Prime, HBO, etc. Sign some deals to encourage people to watch my movies on streaming. I could also develop some home entertainment technologies to improve movie quality. So a lot of people now just watch movies at home because their stereo system is just as good as watching it at the cinema, well, I could help develop those technologies, or maybe even buy one of those companies, so therefore people are going to watch my movies at home. What about the restraining forces? Well, what we're going to do there is overcome them or prevent them. How can we eliminate some of those things that are stopping this? The first thing we could do is sign up those big name directors to exclusive streaming deals. So Netflix has just done this with Steven Spielberg and said, we are going to pay you hundreds of millions of dollars to make your movies so we can stream them before they go to the cinema. That totally eliminates that restraining force. What else? We could implement cost-cutting measures to make the filming of our movies, the cost of them, lower. So they're quite low already, but we could find other ways to make them cheaper. Maybe we only make movies that take place in one location, like Paranormal Activity. And lastly, there's a bit of a stigma about movies that go straight to streaming aren't very good quality, and one of those reasons is you're not eligible for the Academy Awards unless it does go to a cinema. We could lobby the Academy to create a streaming category award. So you've got Best Picture, but then you've also got Best Streaming Picture, and therefore it's got a bit more credibility, and that's going to encourage us to make this change. So all up, we can see a theory that from beginning to end that helps us analyze what's going to change for us, what we should change, but also how can we sort of encourage that, and how can we prevent the things that are stopping us. And that's the key thing from Lewin's theory. That's your job as a manager.